Can I just summarize? I wasn't sure that I understood something you said earlier, though. Insofar as attributions of propositional attitudes involve reliance on empathy or principles of plausibility, psychological plausibility, that don't deliver determinate, objective answers to what somebody meant, for example, then would your conclusion be that attributions of propositional attitudes aren't objective, are as suspect as the notion of translation, for example, as little as unsuitable as forming part of a science as facts about meaning and translation?
Yes. I think that I think I could accept that, and that would be that would account for the dangler status of these verbs. There are certainly a good deal, in the case of belief, for instance, no doubt a good deal when we limit in one way or another the range of the topics, a belief concerning which we're thinking about at the time. Some behavioral criteria could be marshaled for the purpose that are thought to be necessary and sufficient for beliefs of that range of sentences, but it's going to be just a small subsection of overall belief and belief in general as an integrated concept. I think cannot be absorbed into science in any systematically satisfactory way.
You've said a number of times in your writings and also earlier today that with regard to sensory experience, subjective experience, as far as you're concerned, there is not much difference between reducing sensory experience to something in the brain, and on the one hand, reducing it on the one hand, and on the other hand, repudiating sensory or subjective experience in favor of states of the brain. However, something does seem a bit funny about this, because in other areas we are very concerned to make a distinction between eliminating and reducing. So, for example, I think most people are fairly clear that in the case of phlogiston and caloric, we've repudiated them rather than reducing them. But in the case of, say, temperature and oxygen, we've reduced them. Temperature is something like mean molecular kinetic energy of the molecules. So we're clear on the difference in those cases. Why should we be any less clear on the difference between elimination, sorry, not less clear, but why should it be a matter of indifference in the case of sensory experience, whether we repudiate them or reduce them?
Yes. Sensory experience, and another example where in a very clear way that indifference emerges is in the reduction of numbers to sets. The reduction of numbers to sets. Russell's definition of a natural number, or Frege's ultimately. There are others which aren't equivalent, but serve just as well. And are numbers this or that sort of set, or is it just that we have those sets and we don't need to consider that there are numbers over and above those? And I think there's no difference here, just a purely verbal difference. And I think equally for the identity theory of the mind, identity with the brain or aspects of the brain, In the case of caloric, perhaps the same thing could be done if it had been thought worthwhile. That some acceptable modern way of construing caloric in terms of the gradations of degree of oscillation on the part of the molecules in the fluid, in the water, whatever it is that's heating up, or the air, and get a conceptual notion of flow in that sense, the flow of the, simply flow of increased activity, and treat that very much as if it were a fluid. I mean, you could say things about it quite analogous to what we say about fluids and what used to be said about caloric, and say, now we've construed caloric, shall we, are we going to have a duality here, quite an uneconomical duality of caloric on the one hand and the particles on the other, or are we just going to or reduce them and just drop the term caloric? It just happens that the scientists, even without contemplating a open option on that point, took what was surely the most reasonable, easiest line by going straight to elimination. But I think that philosophically, these cases may be alike. But then there'll be other cases, unlike caloric, where no such easy correlation, formal isomorphism, does suggest itself. And then the question, in those cases, one simply wouldn't say that there was a question of choice between elimination and mere correlation, but strict elimination.
Just to follow up to that, to your answer there, doesn't it seem intuitively wrong to say that there is no such thing as subjective experience?
It certainly is intuitively wrong, yes, indeed. If there's anything that's intuitively wrong. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong.
But since we seem to know that there is such a thing from our own case, why should we be equally happy with saying that there is no such thing, and also equally happy with saying there is no such thing on the one hand, and on the other hand saying, well, there is subjective experience, but we know what it is. It's a certain brain state.
It's like the indeterminacy of more generally of reference, namely that there's no observational distinction to be drawn.
Well, here's a thought as to what an actual concrete scientific difference would be. Perhaps we should switch from the example of sensory experience to thought. This is the same point I raised earlier. If we could have the same thoughts in beings with different physical constitutions, then it would seem to make sense to think of the thought as an entity at a level of description that cannot easily be either reduced or eliminated in favor of, say, the physiology, because we would have different physiologies in one case from another.
Good. Well, now, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that we've got a principle of individuation of thoughts, so that it does make sense to speak of same thought. Mm-hmm. And let's suppose that, as you are suggesting, that there are different physical conditions producing the same thought, which is certainly to be expected if we do arrive at what seems to be a reasonable principle of individuation, which I find baffling, however. Then we can go ahead and define a thought as the class of all those all those neural states which, as we say, produce or issue in that thought.
Of course, this might be an infinite class.
But I don't mind that. But but might it quite? Because after all, presumably there's just going to be a finite number of ultimate particles in the nervous system.